Welcome to Dorks Being Dorks, a Brewster Baseball Association podcast where we talk about out-of-the-park baseball and how it works in the BBA. I am Ron Collins, General Manager of the Yellow Springs 9. Today I've got Ted Schmidt from California and Stephen Lane from Long Beach, so it's like I'm surrounded by the Pacific Division here to talk. Thanks so much, Ted and Stephen, for joining me. This is going to be a really fun conversation, I think.
I'm happy to be here. It's nice to be a guest instead of a host on one of these for once. It's a little bit different perspective.
You just don't want to do all the editing.
That's exactly as we were talking before. I don't want to. This is to do that at all. So this is a lot of fun to not have to even worry about it. I think Steven's going to be a little bit more interesting than I am with regards to options. He has a little bit more strategy and uses them more creatively. I have pretty dry takes on everything. I'm one of the most conservative GMs.
Well, that's what makes the world go around, is all the difference. As you noted, we're going to be talking about different types of options today that go onto contracts. The first segments of this were basically Stephen and me talking about contracts in various different long-term situations, and so we'll segue into options. Let me start with Stephen in that sense, since he's always the most interesting person on the podcast. Let's start with the easy ones, right? Let's talk about team options, which I think almost everybody uses to some degree. Long Beach and California both have players on team options right now. Stephen, what are your thoughts? How do you use team options? What do you think they do for you?
I try to use team options. Well, let me back up a little bit. I think I've started using team options a little more in the past few years than when I first started in the BBA. I think I learned some lessons early on that if you can tack on an option or two, then for some players it's really worthwhile. So you look at the player and see if if there's a little more risk with age or position. Those are definitely indicators that would make me lean towards adding some team option years at the end of a contract.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I look at it. I mean, most of these players that you're going to be signing in let's say look at free agent signings, the contract length is probably going to put them somewhere into an age that you don't know if they're going to be the player that they are when you sign them. And I like to fill in those last years with options just because it gives you a chance to get out of it if it turns out that player doesn't work out. That's for some of your more talented guys. And then the other ones are if you want to look at the Crusaders roster, a guy like Jesus Fernandez, who is basically my platoon right-handed bat outfielder, plays center field mostly for me, but he's got a smaller contract, not a big-time piece. To not give him options and to make those guarantee years still would have been relatively low risk. He's not making much money, and I've got replacements on the way, and that's another use of options. So if you have somebody coming up out of your minors, but you don't know exactly what year they're going to get there and you're signing another piece or you've got something else that you're using as kind of a placeholder, the options give you the flexibility to know that, okay, I've got this person on my roster until I don't need them. And so they're a good way for, cheaper deals too, to just give yourself some more flexibility.
Yeah, I like listening to both of you talk, because in between the cracks, what I hear you both saying is that you use a team option to manage the risk levels, right? I think Long Beach has Mike Bailey is on a contract with a team option or two at the end. The interesting one on California to me was Chip Saunders. What is that, about a $4.5 million contract with a team option? Saunders seems like kind of a player who's in that middle zone. You look at Fernando Moreno and the Baileys and some of the higher end players, you're mostly looking at risk for a $10 or $20 million contract that you may have to cut. But somebody like Saunders is $4 or $5 million. That's actually a reasonable chunk of money. But he could be worth a whole lot more before it's all said and done. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on Chip Saunders.
Saunders is never going to do a whole lot with a bat. That's very exciting, right? And the bar is lower for catchers, but he's even still a pretty poor hitting catcher. There was some talk recently about catcher defense. Again, it seems to come up once a year or so, and I am firmly in the boat that catcher ability is huge. Over his career, Saunders, his catcher ERAs, which is, again, over a single season, very noisy. But over 6 to 7 years, he's consistently been about half a run lower than his backups. I don't care what he hits. But all of his value is tied up in his defensive ability. And I've seen catchers kind of wane in terms of, some of them hold up fine, but some of them start to take lumps. And if Saunders even gets down to like an 8 rating a catcher, he's not worth having on a roster. And so that's more of a, anytime I'm signing a deal where a guy gets into the end years or 34, 35, looking at that, I just almost always try to make sure those last years are options so that if they fall off a cliff, you can get that money back. Tying up your cap room with dead weight contracts is just a surefire way to lose competitiveness. That's really the reasoning there. It's just another risk, hedge against risk. You don't know what a player is going to be that far out.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and actually that's an interesting one, because to me, one of the risks that we often don't talk about is the risk of not being able to sign other players while you're trying to decide whether you're going to execute those options, right? Because Out of the Park has this weird thing where you can't tell your owner that you're not planning on executing a option.
Right. That's something Randy and I have been harping about, people not using them. But as you pointed out several times, that's a really good reason to not put team options on not put options at all on players is it can. And that's when I'm in a crunch right now. One of the reasons I haven't thought of that is I don't operate normally at the salary cap. I try to play with about 100 to 102, 103 million roster tops, so that I never get into that can't sign the next year player sort of window situation. And I have now hurt myself with some of these options. Like Owens, I'm 2.2 million over the cap projected next year, and maybe I shouldn't have given Owen Stark a $1.8 million option for next year. I mean, I'm probably going to pick it up, but on the other hand, is the ability to know that I can pick him up next year worth the fact that I was unable to make some other moves? Probably not. So I think you bring up a good point. You do have to be careful to not tie up your cap space and kind of damage your flexibility moving forward.
What are your thoughts on that, Stephen?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a consideration that you have to have, and not only in free agents, but I think that it impacts more, at least in my experience, with extensions in the middle of the season. If you're up against the cap and you've got somebody with an option for 10, 12, 15 million, you're up against your cap or you're up against your budget, it may be hard to offer that extension in the middle of the season.
That's always an interesting problem set. It's kind of like when I listen, Ted, to you guys do your trade and or free agent podcasts, right? Because it depends on where you draw your system diagram. If you're asking, is this player worth that kind of a risk? That's one way of answering the question. And the other way of answering the question is, if I look at my organization as a whole, what is this contract going to do to me? And often we talk about a bad contract when going back to last segment and the long-term contracts. One single bad contract at $25 million a year can really hurt you because you're digging into your budget and or salary cap.
Yeah.
Same type of things with options, but generally in team options, you're doing it to personally control the risk. Let's segment into the more controversial element, and let's talk about player options for a little bit, because I think if I'm going to, I'll tee this up and let you guys talk about it or argue about it a little bit, right? I think Ted is fundamentally of the frame of reference that says that all player options are death to be avoided. I think Stephen and Long Beach comes from a slightly different perspective in that there are sometimes some values to plugging a player option in. I'd be interested in hearing the two of you kind of reframe that point of view, because I look at your rosters and you do have some kind of differences of opinion that show up in those accounting screens. So talk to me about player options.
There's not a single opt-out or player option in mine. There's a striking difference compared to Steven's. Steven, you're going to have to convince me that there's an upside to player options. I'm not saying that it can't work out in your favor. I just don't want to plan on it, because my general view on them is that compared to real baseball, I think there's this idea that putting in a player option can lower the overall dollars that you have to offer the player. And if that were the case in OTP, and it may be, I can see a little bit of value to them. I think the problem is that you see players in OTP accepting deals that are sometimes less than what other teams offered and I don't know how you can figure out the value of a player option in OTP, like what you're actually able to knock off your total money offered by putting in the player options. So not knowing that, I think if the player underachieves or you overpaid, then they generally don't opt out and you're stuck with a bad deal. Or if you put in the player option and you're happy with the deal, well, a lot of times that means they're going to end up opting out. And so I just don't see too many ways it works in your favor. But I'm willing to let you attempt to convince me otherwise.
Yeah, I definitely won't get up on the hill for player options and try to convince you that you should be using them all the time. It's not something that I seek out in a contract. The only one I have on my roster right now is Carlos Gonzalez, and he has not only an opt-out after this season, but he also has a player option of the final year if he does not opt out. So if a player is requesting player option or an opt-out, sometimes it's hard to get that out of their mind, and especially if you're looking at free agency in this league tends to move pretty quick for the top guys. So if they're asking I may be willing to give them, that opt out or that player option. Obviously, the player option is friendly for the player. Like you said, they're gonna opt out if they were good, and in that situation you would have wanted it to be guaranteed, and if they were bad, then they're gonna opt in, and you shouldn't have had that in there at all. One thing I would make a point of is that the mid-contract opt-outs, obviously in MLB, that's always player-friendly, no doubt about it. But in OOTP, I'm not yet convinced that the AI is smart enough to always make a good decision. I couldn't think of any one contract in particular, but I do seem to have in my memory one or two players who opted out in the BBA and then ended up signing for less as a free agent. So that would be the only qualifier that I would put on those mid-contract opt-outs for OOTP in general.
Steven, I can't possibly imagine that you would believe that the out-of-the-park baseball games AI would not be able to make a absolutely perfect decision on every one of these.
All that complicated financial multivariable. Yeah, it's I think the opt-outs, the player options, as Ron said, I think are deaf. I think you could use opt-outs cleverly, especially if you were like, we don't have enough young players come into free agency, unfortunately. But let's say that we had 27, 28-year-olds occasionally hitting free agency, and we've had players getting into the league at younger ages, so we might see more of that in a few years. But I could see an opt-out being useful in that, let's say that there's a big 27-year-old bat in free agency, and you had a competitive window of the next 3 years, but you really didn't want to have to sign that player to a 6-year deal. I could see you using an opt-out there to say, you know what, I'll sweeten up a year or two of this right before the opt-out and then make the salaries after the opt-out a little bit less, but the overall deal, the overall money is still more than you would be able to offer in a shorter deal, knowing that the player would most likely opt out. And you could be creative and do it that way. I think there is some flexibility to have. Then I agree with Steven. I can't think of examples, but I know we've seen players opt out that just shouldn't have, and other ones opt in where you're just kind of like, okay, great, but whatever.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great unknowns within out of the park, and the whole context of what we're doing here is talking about out of the park and how it operates in relation to the rule set that we use in the BBA and our cultural economy, and how different GMs like Kyle are very much in Ted's camp. Don't mess with the player option at all. And yet you still see some very established GMs that use player options. I'm thinking, Matt has a couple of guys in Sweet World and Brewer, superstars who have player options at the last year of their contract, which I thought is kind of an interesting question from how do we view the negotiation process within out of the park? How do out of the park players negotiate?
Well, I think that is a good question, and maybe I don't think there are too many people that have a better feel for what OOTP is doing than Matt, and he might feel or know or have experience that a lot of time those last year, especially for a player that's like not at the end of their career, that maybe players will choose to opt out to renegotiate or to get to free agency so they can sign a longer deal.
Mm-hmm.
To be fair, I don't have a lot of experience with player options and what players do with them, so I just don't give them.
Yeah, Stephen, I'd be interested in your take on this because you have Carlos Gonzalez. You talked about, to me, he's in a very similar situation as my own Lucas McNeil, right? Both of them are ready to go into a player opt-out for this coming season, this coming off season. But in the context of Ted's conversation, it struck me, we have players coming into the league earlier in their age span. I think Lucas McNeil started at age 21. He's now going to be 29. And the out of the park players' model of what they're requesting and so forth seems to be shifting a little bit. Lucas McNeil signed for $10 million for a couple of years and then wanted an opt-out, right? Carlos Gonzalez signed for, I think it's $14 million for a couple of years and now has an opt-out that will go on further. The push-pull here is I loved having Lucas McNeil for a couple of years at $10 million. Who wouldn't want Cargo at $14 million for a couple of years? But the downside to that is it throws a huge amount of uncertainty in our planning when it comes to the following years. Guys, those are not, unlike the Chip Saunders situation with California at $4 or $5 million, these are $15 million of your future payroll that is uncertain until that decision gets made, right? So what are your thoughts about that?
It's there because he wanted it, and I don't I don't know that I like it, but I don't know what the contract would have had to be without it. And I think, like a lot of contracts, like I talked about in the free agency, you've got to really take it one at a time and evaluate the individual player and see about their loyalty and their performance and your anticipation of when they're going to decline. And like you said, it's a lot of uncertainty, not only in your budget, but also just in your on-the-field performance. Cargo is, at least 4 to 5 wins. McNeil is probably a few wins more than that. So it just kind of increases the complexity there, and I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, so apologize.
No, I think it's a good conversation or a good backdrop off of that, right? I liked your word complexity because, to Ted's point, you don't actually know what the out-of-the-park algorithms are doing. You don't know if you hadn't have had a opt-out for Carlos Gonzalez at $14 million, would you have had to pay $18 or $20 million in order to keep him around for that whole time? I don't know. In a real-life situation, perhaps that's true. Perhaps a real-life player would take a million or three less in order to get an opt-out. I don't know. But if you'd have had to pay $20 million for Cargo in the last couple of years, how would that have affected your ability to compete within the rest of the salary cap, right? Because we have a salary cap where Major League Baseball teams do not.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been, if I was another $6 million on him, then that's a lot. For example, just that you look at that number, and I brought in Julio Velasco to shore up my rotation, and he's $6 million. So, if I had been right up on the cap, I would have been looking at, do I cut Mike Bailey because he's injured and out for the year and just eat? Well, I'm eating that money anyways. That's not a good example, but do I have to cut?
Well, if you cut him, you eat the money, but you don't eat it against your salary cap.
Yes, exactly. So do I do that? Do I have to cut somebody else? I'm really stuck with what I've got. So if the opt-out means that he took a few million less on an annual basis, then that's worth it to me.
This might become more important going forward in terms of trying to bribe players to take lower average annual value deals with opt-outs and maybe even with player options. simply that we have seen a huge increase in the asking prices of players for signing extensions and free agency, although most of us are so stubborn with free agency that we just wait for them to come down. I've never run into really, once I got my budget and my revenue in shape where I could pay up to the salary cap and have some slush money to spare. I never had a problem running 100. If you gave me 100 and 100 million, 105 million worth of players, could always put a competitive team out there. If you listen to some of the free agency recap stuff that I do with Randy, I am clearly somebody who does not believe in overpaying for players. I think once you do that, it's a slippery slope, and you start getting into weird situations where you're always robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I tend to not do that. And up to this point, really, the salary cap to me has been plenty high enough that you can put a really talented team out there as long as you never, ever overpay anyone. But on the other, look, I've got Luis Gracia, who's in the running for Nebraska, signed for $13 million this year and $11 million the next year and 10. And, the DeFazio contract, I had to get goofy, like as you guys mentioned, that 1 year with a $23 million year to bump up the average annual value, but the rest of it's really reasonable. But with these asking prices going up a ton, well, I might have to consider using options if they truly do work in a way that they get players to take a lower average annual value.
Actually, one of my notes here was that as the player model gets better, the idea of opt-outs and player options becomes much more relevant. The other aspect that you've mentioned before and that relates into this is the whole point of what are the market forces out there. In the past, we've usually had no more than 2 or 4 players, big name players out in the free agent market. And as Steven said, our free agency works in such big chunks, right? I mean, you do one and then you get 2 weeks or 3 weeks of time. So you only get like 5 cycles through free agency. So you have to kind of make your best offer.
Right.
So how does the player model relates to those things differently, that might be a big deal. One comment in looking at this, we have 12 fairly big name players who are facing opt-outs this year. If 50% of those execute their opt-out, we'll have 6 big name players coming in from opt-outs, which are in the middle of their contracts and tend to be younger.
Who is that, by the way, besides McNeil and Gonzalez?
I've got 3. I've got Lelouch, McNeil, and my center fielder Carlos Garcia, who's a smaller one.
Yeah.
Right. Don Draper from Wichita, solid infielder, right? Vancouver's Jose Morales and Alfredo Bermudez. Cargo from Long Beach. We've got Norris Rutledge from Jacksonville. Jesus Ramos from Edmonton. Elijah Curry from Brooklyn, solid hitter. And Juan Jose Elizondo and Antonio Correa from Atlantic City. So Correa is done, but Elizondo is one of those weird guys.
That's gonna be. I don't wish anything bad upon either of you or your franchises, but there's a part of me that kind of just hopes all those players opt out just because I want to see a good free agency class for once. I don't have any money to spend in it, but I just want to see something happen.
And that's beyond the players who are actually heading to free agency, right? I mean, I've got another in Angel Di Castillo who wants an arm and a leg, right? And so he's probably going to free agency, unless something weird happens over this next month or two. The whole conversation that relates into what you're talking about there, though, Ted, I think is that the world could well be changing in this question of how much an opt-out influences the negotiation inside free agency is an unknown.
Right.
It could be 0 or it could be fairly high.
What I've noticed, and the only one that I have a lot of experience with is team options, is that having a player ask for 5 guaranteed years and making the 5th year a team option as long as you put a good hefty buyout in it, does almost nothing to their asking price at all. And I'm not talking about a little chintzy, $800,000. If you're paying him $10 million, put in a $3.5 million buyout fee for that team, and they don't care. It doesn't change what they ask for on the average value at all, as long as you have a really good sized buyout for your team options. So not to expect that player options would work the exact same way, and opt-outs are probably a totally different animal, but I do wonder if they don't move the needle as much, at least in earlier versions. I wish we knew more about what's going to happen going forward.
But then where would the joy be? Where would the magic be if you knew everything about how the game worked?
Right.
Let me take another small twist on this because there's another use that I have seen, and I've used it a time or two, and that is the idea of adding a player option or a player opt-out on the last year of a contract that also has a team option, so it effectively becomes a mutual option. What do you guys think about that?
So does that work now? Because
Yes.
when it first was brought into the game, it didn't work. Okay, so it works now. But the first year it showed up, I had an opt-out team option, and the player decided to opt in, and I never got to decide whether or not I was going to execute my team option. Which is whatever. I would have taken it anyway. Good. Well, nice to hear that it actually does work.
What are your thoughts on that, Stephen?
I've never done that, but I think it could definitely be a tool instead of just giving a straight player or team. I don't know that it would be widely applicable. It's certainly something that could make sense for the right player.
I think you're thinking it would have to be like marquee player, don't know if you're going to want them on the roster that year or not, don't know if they're going to decline, don't know what they're going to be like, but also you're using their opt-out for the typical reasons you do to maybe lure them to stick around for a little bit. I think in the right situation, it could be a really powerful tool. Again, I'm super conservative when it comes to contracts, and I don't know that I would like to pretend that I know what's going to happen that many years in advance.
The example that I have in mind for right this minute is my own Carlos Gonzalez, right, who I signed last year, essentially as a one-year deal with a mutual option for next year. And that was at $6.75 or $6.8 million, whichever it is. And my thinking on that was that from a overall, management of risk standpoint, that adding the player option really didn't change my overall planning scheme, right? It's only 1 year out. The other aspect of that is that at $6.7 million, I don't care if he opts out. It doesn't influence me because I'm very happy to go back and get another center fielder. So effectively, I may end up sending him back to free agency at $6.8 million anyway, because I think I can probably get him for $4 or $5 million if that comes about. So essentially, I knew I was slightly overpaying anyway, and this was a way for me to manage the risk of the second year's contract and still hopefully get him to agree to come play for me.
Yeah, no, I think he's a good example of where it does make sense. So maybe that is where maybe it's the shorter deals where you know that you've got a decision like that coming up relatively soon. I don't know that I would like to predict 5-6 years down the road, knowing that would be a useful salary structure or contract structure. But for a situation, with a guy that you may or may not need next year and may or may not be happy with, I think it's not a bad move. I definitely like it a lot more than the purely player controlled aspect.
Alrighty, let's twist down to 2 more very quick questions, probably. Let's talk about vesting options, right? That's an option that we don't often talk about. So
they're the best. There's nothing. Vesting options are fantastic, and the reason they're fantastic is because we can be heartless. Unlike in real baseball, I have to deal with the fact that my St. Louis Cardinals are going to play Dexter Fowler next year. I don't know why they would do it. It's a sunk cost. They should cut him. They should just release him from the roster. But they won't do that. That doesn't happen in real life for who knows what reason GMs or managers do dumb things. But we don't do that. We don't have to do that. So we can use vesting options as basically a non-buyout team option or I never intended to play you that next year or the final year with this vesting option at all. But you know what? If you're amazing and you surprise me and you vest, fantastic. They're the lowest risk, completely manipulatable. Is that a word? They're fantastic. I love vesting options.
Stephen?
I don't really use them, but I definitely see Ted's point. It may be something that needs a little tweaking to limit the criteria to be, realistic, kind of like the tweaking that's been done to increase the buyouts on team options. But yeah, like Ted said, it's you're completely in control of it, and and it offers you that opportunity to keep a player around if he surprises.
Yeah, I think you struck on an important aspect that either people think about or don't think about, and that is the question of how Out of the Park values the idea of a vesting number. I tend to look at them, I don't use them enough when it comes down to it. I tend to agree with Ted's point of view. I do worry that they're able to be fiddled with a little bit by a savvy GM who can play the metagame better than the AI figures it out. But actually, I tend to look at them mostly as injury insurance, right? I gave, for example, Jose Chavez a vesting option at the end of his contract, specifically because I figured the chances of him making it through the 6 years without getting crushed are almost none. So I didn't have to deal with the team option and a buyout.
Well, and that's a really good, I think that's probably the single most underutilized option that we have is injury prone, especially pitchers. They're the most predictable in the I might miss a ton of time sort of range. Now, Chavez has hung in pretty strong the last few years, but when you have players that you're significantly worried about them losing time to injury, like Tully Crow should never sign a multi-deal that's not just all vesting options. Like that's, like at this point, like that's, and you don't see a whole lot of that. And I think that's probably a really underutilized tool.
Yeah, I agree totally. It's not something that I think about, right? And I have to think about it when it comes down to it. I think about player options and I think about team options, and players ask for opt-outs, but players relatively rarely ask for vesting options, which is probably in their best interest.
Right. One of the ones one of the uses I like for vesting options is anybody that you're like coming off a down season. It's like, man, they've not been good for a couple of years. Was it the park? Was it just the system they were playing in the park, and that was the problem? Vesting options for those players can be fantastic because a lot of times you can get them on like essentially a 1 year deal with a couple of vesting options, or with a vesting option and a team option, and it's the 1 year that you're paying like $6 to $7 million because they still want a little bit of money even though they've been terrible. But a lot of times you can get those vesting years, maybe a couple million less, so like a $7 million, $5 million deal. And if the player bounces back and becomes good again, you're happy to pay them that $7 million, and now they vest because you gave them enough playing time because they were good. And now you've got a legitimately good player for a couple years. And that's one of the spots I like to do that, and that's I use them a lot with I'm a lefty heavy system, so I always need right-handed platoon bats, and I'll use them a lot for veterans that really like a 34-year-old vet that just had a terrible year. I'll pick them up and throw in a vesting option, and about most of the time they still suck. But about a third of the time, they really bounce back, and I get them for a few more years after that, and they're great.
No, I like that. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I hadn't thought about using them as a veteran release valve kind of thing. That's an interesting twist.
I mean,
which is why we're here chatting, right? So we can all learn new things about how to use the game.
And that's shouldn't be anything groundbreaking, right? Like not that I'm not trying to say you guys should have thought of this, but I realized I just spent like 3 minutes talking about like using the vesting option the way that it was always intended. It is a prove it contract, right? And it's I think that there's a lot of good ways that you can do that. Anyway, to recap, I love vesting options. I should use them more. I think we should all use them more. If you're not going to
you get a vesting contract. You get a vesting contract.
Right. The whole team. Who knows? Like whoever someday will look at my team and like year plus one will just be half vesting contracts. It'll just be whoever plays well. Actually, the team we'll see that on is Allen. He'll sign like 1 billion pitchers. They'll all have vesting contracts, and whichever one's sticking is Cyclone. We'll all be there the next year.
Well, let me wrap this up with one final twist thing that we often don't think about here, and that is compensation picks in the draft. And how do we think about the effect of options on compensation picks?
Steven, you should go first.
Okay. I like the fact that we do the compensation picks, and I like that it's something that's accessible by pretty much everybody if you're deliberate about it. And it's something that definitely tilts. I mean, in and of itself, it's not enough to make player options more valuable than team options, but in certain situations, it might be better to sign that guy for a 1 or 2 year contract and don't tack on any team options, or make the options player options, so that if you anticipate he might be someone who would help you get a compensation pick at the end of the contract, then you do get that out of him in addition to the performance on the field.
So I think I've been on the record before saying I think we should get rid of comp picks, but that's a whole other argument. The answer with him in relation to options is I don't think about it enough. It's a mistake that I've continually made. And that's one of the drawbacks to team options, especially on players that you really think could have a pretty good year, is that if you let them go, you can't get a comp pick. And it's just not something that's really been part of my analysis of offering contracts, is this player couldn't net me a comp pick later. And I think part of that is because I'm relatively inactive in free agency. I tend to not sign high-end players. But still, it's both of you I have seen maybe not sign a player with the intent of getting a comp pick, but knowing that there is a possibility that that's what this will turn into. That is a drawback to team options, is that you really are cutting into your potential of getting picks. And extra first-round picks matter. They really do make a difference. So,
yeah, if there's one thing to pull out of here, in my mind, the idea that a comp pick is attached to a player who either accepts their player option or who plays out their contract is just an idea that needs to be in the head of every general manager. I think that, if you follow the legend of Billy Beane, he's theoretically kind of the first guy who truly understood that, right? And it became a small market tool to use. But yeah, I think that the main thing is to realize that even as you're trading a guy, we're sitting here at trade deadline, and a team who has a player, a star on an expiring contract, needs to be thinking about it from the point of view that, hey, I am trading a first-round draft pick plus this guy,
right,
for whatever they get, right, before it's all said and done.
Don't just sell them for a bucket of baseballs because they're going to walk.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, Stephen?
No, that's a big topic for another day.
Well, given that, any other thoughts on options before we call this one a day?
Not really. I think they're a tool. That's really what they are. And like any tool, if you're using it, you should be using it deliberately. One of the worst, in not just an OTP, but in any situation where you're given a tool or an ability that you can use, if you're not understanding what you're doing with it while you're doing it, it is a good way to get yourself in trouble. So if just because a player asks for a contract with options and opt-outs and other stuff in it, doesn't mean that you should sign that contract. You should think about what those mean and where they fit into your structure, and don't just take them as something that's a necessary evil or part of the deal. That's kind of just my thoughts on them.
Steven?
I think we pretty well covered it. I'm good.
Alrighty. Well, again, thank you so much for your time here today. I know pulling you away from the NFL or your mousecapades, Stephen, which you can talk about on the board if you want to sometimes. Anyway, thanks again, and we'll hit another topic later on.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys.
The Brewster Baseball Association is an out-of-the-park baseball league commissionered by Mr. America himself, Matt Rechtenwald, and competed in by an amazing group of outstanding general managers. Check us out at montybrewster.net. You have been listening to Dorks Being Dorks, a podcast where we put BBA GMs together to talk about out of the park and how it works in the BBA. Music is Some of My Fears by Daisy May and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license.
I have lost everything. Just like the bucks are dead on the range. The cross is twisted, the stars that not shine. The creation's threatening, the worry is mine. The king was singing, and now he's dead. John wanted peace, and it's war instead.